Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this MED virtual panel that we have organized in cooperation with the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. I am Aldo Liga, I am a research fellow at the Middle East and North Africa Center at ISPI. This event intervenes in an incredibly tense moment for the whole region, let's say in between the Iranian drones and missile attacks against Israel last Saturday and a possible Israeli retaliation. Slightly more than 6 months have passed since the terrible assault launched by Hamas against Israeli villages and kibbutz bordering Gaza and the violent Israeli reaction on the Strip. Almost 34,000 people have been killed so far. Over 75% of the Gaza population has been displaced. The war has damaged or destroyed large parts of Gaza, hitting thousands of homes, hundreds of schools, dozens of hospitals. Restrictions on the entry and distribution of aid have sensibly worsened the humanitarian situation, and even if aid deliveries appear to have slightly increased over the past few weeks, the situation remains alarming. Several UN agencies consider the prospects of famine in Gaza imminent. In this context, it's important to remind that more than 200 aid workers have been killed so far. As the prospects for a new temporary ceasefire are fading away and the risk of a full-scale regional conflict is looming large, discussing the immense human suffering of people in Gaza and the deep political and social implications of this unfolding tragedy is more and more important, as there is no doubt that the human and political scars that this crisis is entailing will shape the future of the whole region. So let me introduce our guests. We have the honor to have with us today Tahani Mustafa, a senior Palestine analyst at the International Crisis Group, Omar, Rahman, fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, and Omar Shakir, who is Israel and Palestine Director at Human Rights Watch. Thanks for being with us today and welcome again. So let's open our discussion. We will have 45 minutes, including a brief final Q&A session open to all of you. So if you have any questions, please type them on our on the live chat that we have on our YouTube channel. So starting with the current situation between and relation between Israel and Iran, I would like to ask a question to all of you. So how could the risk of a military escalation between Iran and Israel influence the conduction of the war in Gaza and the prosecution of the military operation in the Strip? Will this prospect of a broader regional war entail additional shifts on the region? Just to give some example in terms of Israeli military strategy in Gaza, in terms of involvement of neighboring countries, or in terms of international pressure. So I would like to start with Tahani, maybe.
Thank you. So I think, in terms of what the implications can be on Gaza, I think there have been suggestions that this could lead Israel to maybe scale back its campaign and intensity. We've already seen the Israelis delay a potential invasion, or looming invasion, in Rafa. But in terms of intensity, we haven't really seen much in the way of scaling back. Especially given that all attention has now shifted from Gaza, unfortunately, giving Israel almost sort of free rein to some degree. We also haven't seen the humanitarian situation improve, despite the fact that the Israelis, since the kind of cross-border, I would say, skirmish a couple of days ago between Iran and Israel, the Israelis are now claiming that they are allowing more humanitarian aid in. Again, that's contrary to what human rights organizations are saying, and I think that's even asking the wrong questions with regards to humanitarian aid. But ultimately, I think when it comes to Gaza, we haven't really seen that much impact. As for other neighboring or regional states, I can't really speak for the majority that had involved themselves, but I think Jordan is a very good case where not only has this not managed to cool temperatures on the ground, it's left the regime in a very, very precarious situation domestically at home, where there was already criticism to the ways in which the US was leveraging previous defense treaties in order to abet and support Israel's campaign in Israel, as well as Jordan's own involvement. And I think this has really just fueled a lot of the opposition and critics and left the regime in quite a precarious situation, both at home and now potentially regionally.
Thank you, Tahani. Omar, Rahman.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've sort of entered a new stage, maybe a change of dynamics as a result of the Iranian operation. But this has been going on for months. I mean, I wrote an article months ago about the inescapability of regional war as a result of Israel's assault, as long as Israel's assault on Gaza continued. And that's even part of a failed U.S. policy to refuse to not only address the situation in Gaza, but to kind of keep it going, to allow Israel to continue onward and to try to put out the flames in the region, and that has just fanned things. But I don't think Iran's direct involvement was ever inevitable. And I think Iran has tried to kind of stay away from a regional escalation and a direct confrontation, both with the United States and the Israelis. We've seen that play out in Iran's behavior. Also, obviously, Iran or the Israelis are a nuclear armed state, and I think that's very much in the Iranian decision-making calculus here, because anything that escalated into a very ugly confrontation with Israel bears that risk for Iran. But there was obviously a direct confrontation here, a direct provocation by the Israelis for attacking this consulate in Syria. I think the Iranians had to respond, and the way they did it in terms of choreographing it and making sure that it didn't have much of an impact, I think was in keeping with Iran's policy so far. But in terms of effect, I definitely think it was a signal to the international community that this possibility of a full-scale war is real, it's there. And I think that adds more pressure on the international community, particularly the United States, to pressure Israel to scale down what's happening in Gaza, to kind of raise the stakes, and perhaps on Israel too. But I think there is a counter effect on the Israelis, in terms of how well coordinated this was, this like kind of total defense by Israel's allies and protecting Israel from the effects of the Iranian attack. I think kind of reinforces Israel's feeling of invincibility here, that in the moment of truth, no matter how much tension there is in the relationship between Israel and its allies, that they'll come to Israel's aid no matter what it does in defending Israel. And I think that, in the psychology of the Israelis will cause them to continue on. And in a sense, like Tahani said, this regional dimension provides a distraction for the Israelis. Right at the same time as this attack happened was the attack on the World Central Kitchen, which created a lot of blowback for the Israelis. But suddenly, as a result of Iran's response, all the attention is on what's happening internationally, the potential for regional war, much less on what's happening in Gaza. And at the end of the day, I think Israel's overarching intention for Gaza is clear, and nothing is going to change that.
Thank you. Conclude this first round with Omar Shakir.
Thank you. I think my colleague sort of said it all, and maybe I'll just synthesize with 2 quick points. The first is that I would underscore the distraction point. The reality here is when all the focus of the international community goes elsewhere, invariably provides cover for the abuses and the atrocities in Gaza to continue. And I think in this particular, and we've seen this script happen. So while everybody was focused on the October 7th attacks in Gaza in October, we saw entire Palestinian communities in the West Bank wiped off the map. We saw settler violence with the involvement of Israeli forces, armed by Israeli forces, with structured impunity. Today, Human Rights Watch released a report documenting at least 7 communities wiped off the map in the West Bank. We've seen killings of Palestinians reach a years-long, 2-decade-long high since the beginning of when the UN began recording these statistics in 2005. We've seen administrative detention without trial or charge, reach a 30-year high in the West Bank. So the model of Gaza West Bank can be understood with Iran vis-a-vis Gaza, where the more we get dragged into a regional war, the less momentum and pressure there is from the international community to focus on the situation in the Gaza Strip. And to give you a very practical example, Tahani and Omar mentioned some of the World Central Kitchen and some of the pressure that had been building on the Israeli government, in particular around suspending arms and an arms embargo, where we started to see certain steps taken by states like Canada, momentum building in other places towards suspending arms. And of course, that debate became much more difficult in the wake of the solidarity that many countries raised with Israel following the Iranian attack. So certainly, should there be a broader regional escalation, it's likely to change the contours of what we're talking about. Another example you can see is Syria, right? Started as a protest movement, eventually that the more this becomes a regional dynamic, it might help certain politicians, but it's certainly not going to be one that helps us to end the atrocities in Gaza.
Thank you, Omar. So let's now deep diving into the topic of this panel, the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza. So Tahani, could you give us a picture of the humanitarian situation in the Strip?
Well, I mean, the humanitarian situation is catastrophic. I think that doesn't even really cut it in terms of a description. But right now you have over 33,000 Gazans who have been killed. That number could very well be an underestimate, considering that there are many that remain under the rubble. Gaza has literally been turned into an ungovernable wasteland. You've got something like 1.9 million that have been displaced more than once. You have the complete, at the moment, famine remains or is very imminent at the moment. In terms of humanitarian aid, again, the question really is more getting in. The question is enough getting in? And, according to human rights organizations, given that Gaza's need is obviously far more significant than what is being allowed in, the answer to that is, unanimously no, despite what the Israelis have now been trying to peddle, claiming that there are now something like 400 trucks going in, where you have the UN instead claiming that on any given day you can have anything between 250 to or sometimes just even 150. In any case, those trucks are nowhere nearly as full as they should be. And when they are getting in, there are arbitrary restrictions, in terms of the materials that are allowed in. And these can, vary between things like oxygen tanks, sanitary towels. It really does vary depending on what Israel decides at the time. And then what's worse is that you don't even have the logistics to actually transport these to the people that need it, including the north, since a lot of this aid is coming in from the south. There has been obviously significant difficulties getting this to the north, where need is the greatest at the moment. Again, they don't have the logistics to transport these things. I mean, when you talk about logistics, you're talking about something as basic as civic infrastructure like roads, where trucks don't even have the capacity to drive over. Not to mention the fact that the Israelis have outright refused to provide any safe routes. The World Central Kitchen is a good example, but also just a couple of days ago, you had a UNICEF convoy that got caught in crossfire. And again, the responsibility on providing safe routes to aid convoys is on the Israelis, which they have so far refused to do. Worse yet, we're seeing countries and mostly coming from Israel's allies, indulge in things like aid drops. We were also seeing them trying to provide aid through sea routes. Again, this is a sticking plaster, given that these are mechanisms that they're resorting to because of the restrictions on land crossings and getting aid through land crossings. And this is something that even the UN has warned is unsafe, costly. And is completely inefficient in terms of actually being able to get sufficient amounts of aid in. We've already seen several Palestinians killed just through airdrops alone. Some have even, unfortunately, had aid either drop on them or they've drowned in the sea trying to get, trying to kind of get to that aid. It really has proved to be completely disastrous. And where you have had local efforts at coordinating access to aid, as we saw with a couple of weeks ago, where the Hamas administration, civil police had tried to coordinate aid with tribes, clans, prominent families, popular committees, political factions, Israel had completely derailed the entire process by killing the two main people in charge of actually effectively, for the first time, you actually had aid reach people in the north and central Gaza that hadn't reached them in months. And it was done so where no one was hurt. It was, very much well coordinated, well delivered, and Israel derailed the entire process. And then that's when we ended up seeing the besiegement of the Al-Shifa hospital, where a lot of these coordination efforts were happening. And not only that, but they ended up destroying the entire hospital complex, which provides something like 30% of Gaza's medical infrastructure. It truly is a catastrophic situation right now.
Thank you, Tahani. Thank you very much. You mentioned restrictions on the entry and distribution of humanitarian aid. Omar Shakir, could you tell us a little bit more about these restrictions and the consequences of these restrictions, and then if you can just give us a picture of the main actors involved into the delivery of humanitarian aid. We have seen regional countries involved, but also the US, European countries, international NGOs. Which are the actors involved in the delivery of aid in Gaza?
Sure. Let me start with the first part of your question. I'm going to, again, echo a lot of what Tahani said very well. I would start by saying that let's not forget basic services. 6 months, the Israeli government has kept electricity shut off in Gaza, and there have obviously been restrictions on the entry of fuel, and that affects many aspects of everyday life for the population. Let's remember that Israel has largely sealed its crossing to the normal entry and exit of commercial goods. It's been unsealed for some aid inspections in recent months. Let's also not forget that water has been shut off from certain pipelines. There's been damage to water infrastructure that rendered, before recent increases, only one of the 3 water lines in Gaza operational, and for a long time that was at less than 50% capacity. It's increased recently. There have been pledges to boost water, but much of the population, especially in North Gaza, lacks access to clean water. In terms of aid getting in, I think Tahani mentioned a lot of this, but obviously the numbers have been woefully insufficient. Let's again remember not only the restrictions on services, but let's also remember Gaza was under a 16+ year closure. 80% of the population relied on humanitarian aid before October 7th. And so you can imagine, with all that we've seen since October 7th, what that means for the population. So not enough trucks are getting in. The composition of what the trucks are not reflecting the needs of the population. Humanitarian organizations who have written about this have talked about denials and delays at Israeli crossing points. They've talked about around what can get in. They've spoken about the lack of safety, and again was noted the strikes, despite deconfliction on aid workers. There have been strikes and use of force against people queuing for aid. There have been strikes on police forces and other local actors in Gaza trying to arrange for the distribution of aid. The Israeli government has a lot of excuses for this, but the bottom line is they're the occupying power. They're bound to meet the humanitarian needs of the population. They're bound to ensure the entry of aid. They're bound to restore order for the population. The Israeli government is violating the International Court of Justice's provisional measures, as Human Rights Watch and other groups have documented. And the court hinted very much at this in its late March ruling on the provisional measures. Let's also remember, in terms of who's distributing aid, the Israeli government has been on a vendetta against UNRWA. It's been blocking its ability to have convoys enter. It has there's been defunding by other states following Israeli government accusations. It's the largest provider of humanitarian aid. We've seen strikes on UNRWA. We've seen strikes on World Central Kitchen. These are groups that are providing aid. We've seen certain countries who have, for some period of time, stopped the entry of aid. We've seen resort to airdrops, which are ineffective. We've seen resort to building a maritime port, which is going to take a long time. And even though there's an Ashdod port in the north that could easily deliver aid, we've seen insufficient use of land crossings. I could go on, but the bottom line result is kids are dying as a result of starvation-related complications. We reported on this last week. We spoke to one doctor who described 26 kids that died as a result of malnutrition and starvation. So the Israeli government has made pledges, and there seems to be some increase in recent days, but let's remember it's been 6 months of this withholding of aid. These are all war crimes. Collective punishment is a war crime. Deliberate withholding of life-saving aid is a war crime. Starvation is a weapon of war. It must end, and lives really hang in the balance.
Thank you, Omar. Looking to the future of Gaza, Omar, Rahman, today the future of Palestine needs to be reimagined, let's say from scratch, and there are a lot of speculation on a possible return of the Palestinian Authority to Gaza. This is a possibility. In your opinion, to what extent is it a viable solution, and on what basis should be the governance of Palestine be rebuilt after the war?
Well, I think, looking to the future is important. Obviously, we can't, it's much more important. We can't lose sight of just the immense catastrophe that's unfolding on the ground today. And I think my colleagues laid that out. And it even goes beyond just the humanitarian situation. I mean, what Israel is imposing on the Gaza Strip is not just a humanitarian catastrophe. It's not just the destruction of human infrastructure and civilian infrastructure and all these kind of things. It's really aimed at erasing the history and the presence of the Palestinians in this land, which stretches back thousands of years. And I think the point of that is to sever their attachment and hopefully displace them into the future. But when it comes to that future and what can be done, I mean, the question over Palestinian representation and reestablishing a unified and representative leadership stretches back well before October 7th. It goes back years. And the Palestinians certainly have a lot to do on that front in terms of, reimagining and rebuilding their representative institutions in order to formulate a vision of the future, a consensus or unified vision of the future, and a unified strategy for achieving that. And so a lot certainly needs to be done on that. And I don't think we're going to see that vision of the future until at first the political house is put in order for the Palestinians. And there are processes and work to achieve that. It's very difficult, but I think it's been galvanized, that process, by the aftermath from October 7th. But the Palestinian Authority itself, as an institution, has a very uncertain future. And there's a reason for that. I mean, the Palestinian Authority was set up as a temporary institution that was only supposed to last 5 years. And it's been extended for 30 years, well past its mandate as a transitional embryonic institution for a state. It was part of the Oslo Accords, which are now defunct. So it is totally unmoored, detached from the peace process itself. And so it has come to operate as an arm of Israel's occupation and apartheid regime. And so for Palestinians, when they're imagining what they want in Gaza in the future and in the West Bank, it's not necessarily the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority may have some role, we don't know yet, but I think Palestinians need to first establish, which direction they're going. When it comes to governing the Gaza Strip in the aftermath of what's happened now, I think we really need to look at what Israel is attempting to achieve on the ground. And I don't think Israel, and I mean, they've been very clear, they have no intention for allowing the Palestinian Authority back into Gaza. They don't even have an intention to allow an international trusteeship to govern Gaza, because I think if the international community was present there, governing and policing, they don't want to do that indefinitely. And there would be pressure mounting on the Israelis to negotiate a political endgame with the Palestinians, which this Israeli government, and I don't think a future one, has any intention of doing. And so I think Israel's plan here is to create a long-term military presence, have the situation on the ground so difficult for civilians that they eventually have to filter out. And it's playing the long game in that sense. And so I don't see what role there is for the Palestinian Authority to return. Neither do they have the capacity, the legitimacy among their own public, especially to come back on the back of an Israeli tank to govern the Gaza Strip. So these are very uncertain things in terms of looking towards the future. And the Palestinians need to answer certain questions about legitimate representation internally before they can move forward in certain aspects. But we shouldn't lose sight that something needs to happen to bring an end to the death and destruction that's unfolding in the Gaza Strip immediately.
Thank you, Omar. Tahani, 4 months ago, several countries cut aid to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, so UNRWA. Today, what is the operational situation on the ground, and why is UNRWA so important for life in the Palestinian territories?
Well, at the moment, I mean, we've seen some countries resume funding. There have been reports about the US also providing something like a 5 million, I think, emergency fund to UNRWA in Gaza. But the situation now for the organization is very precarious. The fact that Israel has been able to make such unsubstantiated claims, and this isn't the first time, by the way, and the fact that countries had so willingly, despite knowing and despite seeing the incredibly, I mean, the evidence itself was very questionable, and this was by the admission of donors that had at the time decided or were thinking of suspending funding. So it's amazing that a country like Israel or a state like Israel is able to hold such sway, despite, obviously the international community knowing the complete fallacies within the evidence presented, and the fact that Israel has never been able to substantiate the claims that it has made against UNRWA and its staff. And that has presented a whole host of other issues now. The fact that you have different international aid organizations that are unwilling but also incapable of doing the work that UNRWA does in the occupied territories. The fact that it's going to be so much more costly for international donors to have to now disperse these tasks that UNRWA does. UNRWA is an organization that doesn't just provide things like humanitarian relief. I mean, in some cases, it really does fulfill state-like functions. It provides things like education, sanitation. A couple of months ago, the times are merging in my head, but back here over the summer, you had an UNRWA strike for workers within the occupied territories that were working for UNRWA were striking over pay. And at the time, I mean, if you entered any refugee camp, you would see piles and piles and piles of rubbish just, sitting there for months on end, simply because the PA didn't have the capacity and wouldn't fulfill any of those functions. People were really struggling in terms of gaining access to things like medical care, education, public sanitation and all these other functions that UNRWA does fulfill. And that's not just confined to the occupied territories, by the way, that's also something that expands to regional states where Palestinian refugees, unfortunately, have not been assimilated in places like Jordan, in places like Lebanon, Syria, where the state refuses to assimilate these people and where that really is the only access they have to things like health and education. So this is going to be quite catastrophic, if we do end up seeing, the worst case scenario, which is UNRWA having to close shop or shut down its operations. So it really has left the organization in an incredibly precarious situation, and there really is no justifying it, especially given that a lot of what Israel is now using to justify, its targeting of UNRWA. Is not only based on completely baseless evidence, but also more importantly, those confessions were taken under duress, under torture. So again, our state like Israel is able to hold such sway is really quite remarkable.
Thank you, Tahani. Omar Shakir, can you tell us about the work that Human Rights Watch has done over the past 6 months? So since the outbreak of the war in Gaza?
Sure. It's quite a long list of grave atrocities. Strip, we've done work documenting unlawfully indiscriminate Israeli airstrikes, including a strike we documented 2 weeks ago on October 31st that killed more than 106 civilians, including 54 kids, many that were playing football. No apparent military target, making it an apparent war crime. We've documented Israel's use of white phosphorus in densely populated areas, which is unlawfully indiscriminate. We've documented the impact of airstrikes on people with disabilities, older people, children. We've documented unlawful strikes on hospitals, on ambulances, the use of explosive weapons in densely populated areas. And we have forthcoming research that looks at some additional strikes as well. Second area of work, of course, we've talked about already today, collective punishment, deliberate blocking of life-saving aid, starvation as a weapon of war, kids dying as a result of starvation. And we have future work that looks at the destruction of objects like water infrastructure necessary for human survival and their legal consequences. Third, we've documented displacement and destruction of infrastructure. The buffer zones we are documenting, I should say. We have a report in the works on these issues and evaluates forced displacement, as well as whether this amounts to other international crimes. We have also in Gaza looked at detentions of healthcare workers, detentions of Gaza laborers within Israel and the West Bank, and more generally, some of the changes in Gaza with regards to detention. This is, some collection of our work on Gaza. In Israel proper, of course, we've documented the taking and holding of hostages, which is a war crime under international law. We've documented deliberate killings of civilians on October 7th. We have a larger report that looks into the October 7th attacks under review. We've documented indiscriminate rocket strikes by Palestinian armed groups. I should say also in Gaza, we documented other attacks, including on Al-Ahli hospital. When it comes to the West Bank, we've documented today, we released a report on settler violence and the Israeli government's responsibility for it, entire communities that have been erased from the map since October 7th. And of course, the phenomenon dates back and it's related to years-long impunity, unprecedented numbers of settler violence. We are currently conducting research on the uptick in killings in the West Bank, which have reached unprecedented levels, trends of arbitrary arrest and torture since October 7th. And of course, we're doing this not just in isolation. We're conducting advocacy that calls for allowing aid in sufficient amounts to get into Gaza, ending unlawful attacks, releasing hostages and others unlawfully detained immediately and unconditionally, imposing an arms embargo on the Israeli government, given the risk it'll be used for serious abuses, as we're seeing on the ground. We're calling for support for the International Court of Justice genocide case of South Africa, support for the advisory opinion that the International Court of Justice is looking into, the need for accountability, including at the International Criminal Court, the need to impose targeted sanctions against implicated Israeli officials, as well as those responsible for settler violence. So our work, like those of many human rights organizations, spans many different research issues and ultimately is trying to stop atrocities. And many have been committed, but many lives continue to hang in the balance, and effort is needed more than ever to end those atrocities immediately.
Thank you. Omar, broadening the picture and having a look to the relations between Israel and the United States, what role has the humanitarian crisis in Gaza if we look at the relations between the American government and the Israeli government?
Well, I think the humanitarian crisis has put pressure on the Biden administration, both domestically inside the United States and internationally, to put more pressure on Israel to act against Israel. Has that really translated into a change in the U.S.-Israeli relationship? I don't think so. The tone has changed since October 7th, but it was not, since the beginning of October 7th when Biden reacted with so much empathy and support for Israel. But it wasn't effusive, cordial relations with Netanyahu before October 7th. So I think it's more returning to that and pointing the finger at Netanyahu in particular. But tone and rhetoric and these type of things can be performative. I think when we look at substance, there's really been no impact, and the U.S. continues to provide Israel everything it could need from weapons. There's been over 100 sales to the Israelis since October 7th of weapons, which is just astounding. There's been military support. There's been intelligence support. There's been diplomatic support, and even $15 billion was supposed to be allocated to the Israelis. That got held up in Congress for issues totally unrelated to Israel. But so the financial support was also being there. Of course, there is a significant widening gap, I think, among the American public and support for Israel, particularly among Democrats and young people, and I think that's going to have an impact, especially in the longer term. And Arab Americans are making their own views felt in this moment because it's an election year, and they are able to wield clout. I mean, almost inadvertently, because They happen to be concentrated in a number of key swing states, and that's having an effect on Biden's on crucial support for Biden. So I think they're able to affect some type of pressure on the Biden administration, and so it's at least had to change its tone, if not take some action. But I think within the political establishment, within the media establishment, within the financial establishment, places where the kind of pro-Israel crowd wields a significant amount of influence, there's been very little change. I mean, we just saw the U.S. Congress, I think yesterday, pass a bill saying that it was anti-Semitic to say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. No mention of the fact that, the Likud party, the party of Netanyahu, has the same thing in essentially their charter, which is, from the river to the sea, basically all of this land from the river to the sea belongs to the Jewish people exclusively. And so, it's very one-sided within those establishments. We haven't seen much change. And I think with the election in November going to be between Biden and Trump, I don't see a lot of change in the immediate future. For the long term, I think there will likely be significant change. Just one more point on this. I think, for a country claiming to lead, the democratic world, the U.S. is acting in a very undemocratic way on Israel's behalf since October 7th. I'm obviously for decades, but in particular since October 7th on the international stage. Like, on what basis does the U.S. exercise the veto against a ceasefire resolution when the rest of the UN Security Council is unanimous in support of that? The role of the Security Council is to bring or uphold peace and security on the international stage, and the U.S. is acting in a very undemocratic way to prevent that from happening. So I just wanted to end with that.
Thank you, Omar. We are almost at the end of this panel. We have received some questions from our audience. One is on the potential military operation in Rafa. So, what could be the humanitarian challenges of this operation in the southern fringe of the strip? And the second one is on the possibility to reach another ceasefire, temporary or permanent ceasefire, and on how far are the prospects for a hostage deal today. So if you agree, I would open these two questions to all of you, just to do a final round before concluding this session, starting with Tahani.
So I think the question on Rafa or the impending invasion, I mean, again, the question, well, I think prior to the Iran-Israel skirmish, the question was really just when. It wasn't necessarily if that was going to happen. And, there was a unanimous consensus. I think there remains a unanimous consensus that it will be catastrophic, considering that you have something like over 1.4 million people sheltering in Rafa, and they have nowhere else to go. There are no safe zones. Israel has literally left not a single patch of that territory untouched in terms of its aerial bombardments. So, I think in terms of the humanitarian consequences, those are going to be completely unimaginable at this point. With regards to the question regarding a ceasefire, I think in the short term, we're very unlikely to see a ceasefire or even a humanitarian pause. We have Hamas and Israel that are working with two exclusively mutual demands here. Israel is going full maximalist in terms of its objective to destroy Hamas. You're not just talking about destroying its military wing, which would be a far more achievable goal, but completely destroying the movement as a whole, which is impossible. And worse yet, there are questions about whether Israel has ulterior motives. They have made no secret of this, making Gaza completely unlivable. Arguably, that can be seen as an extension of its policy towards the Gaza Strip since 2007, where the goal was to make Gaza unlivable. And now today, it is an ungovernable wasteland, quite literally. So even if you were to see a ceasefire tomorrow, there's absolutely nothing to host the 2.2 million people that remain there, or whatever is going to be left of the population to to really host. And then on the other hand, you have Hamas that is insisting on a permanent cessation of hostilities. Now, Hamas have tried, again, we have to bear in mind that Hamas doesn't really have much to offer in the way of concessions, and what they're asking for is not in any contradiction to international law. They're asking for a full withdrawal of Israeli troops, the allowing people to return back to their homes, including in northern and central Gaza, which Israel right now is absolutely adamant on only allowing women and children. But again, its criteria for what constitutes a child is anyone under the age of 14. So that's a huge majority of the population that won't be allowed to return back. Israel is refusing to allow for a permanent cessation of hostilities because that interferes with its objective of destroying Hamas completely. And also Hamas are looking for the unrestricted access of aid and some kind of political settlement to the Israel-Palestine conflict, one that will end up leading to some kind of self-determination for the Palestinians. Again, out the question, given that the Israeli government and successive governments, by the way, have continuously renounced any previous agreements they've made with the PLO. They have, since the 7th of October, outright, insisted that any state-like entity in Gaza is not even a consideration when we think about post-war. So we are really at a crossroads here, and worse yet, you do not have any serious diplomatic pressure being put on Israel. The US has not put any red lines here. There's no serious diplomatic pressure for Israel to really offer the Palestinians, Gazans or Hamas anything serious in the way of concessions. So I don't think we're likely to see any kind of pause or ceasefire in the short term, especially given the lessons that Hamas and Gazans learned back in November, where we did see a humanitarian pause and where Israel managed to find loopholes and leeways to violate that humanitarian pause. And really what it did was effectively suspend what ended up, being the resumption of what is effectively amounting to a genocide.
Thank you, Tahani. Omar, Rahman, maybe, and then we conclude with Omar Shakir.
Sorry, I was muted there. I think Tahani did an excellent job summarizing that. I have very little to add. I think you can bundle the question of Rafa and the question of a ceasefire almost together in the sense of what Israel is trying to achieve in the Gaza Strip. And I think she laid that out very well, which I think is to make the Gaza Strip unlivable. At the moment, while Rafa has been bombed and besieged, it remains, the last remaining foothold for 1.8 million people that have huddled in a mass there. And if Israel's intention is to put constant pressure on the civilian population in Gaza in order to see the depopulation of the Gaza Strip, then it makes sense to carry on and to bombard and besiege the Gaza and the Rafa crossing there. In terms of a ceasefire, I think she laid it out also well in terms of what Hamas is asking for and how that doesn't jive with Israel's objectives vis-a-vis the Gaza Strip, because it's not just what Israel says it wants to do, it's also what it says it won't accept. If it's not going to accept the return of the Palestinian Authority, if it's not going to accept the return of Hamas, if it's not going to accept the international community or an international trusteeship in the Gaza Strip, connect those dots and just, you can paint a picture of what Israel's intentions is there, which is a permanent military presence without providing anything in terms of services for the civilian population of the Gaza Strip. All the civilian infrastructure has been pretty much wiped out. Food is coming in and aid is coming in at a trickle. People are starving. And so, Israel's not going to change that situation, and it has laid out no plan and no intentions to offer an alternative to that would sustain life in the Gaza Strip. And so I think ultimately it's about pressuring the civilian population, and Hamas's demands, I think, contradict that. And I think Israel's, it would like to see the return of the hostages, but everything it's done up to this point has shown that it really deprioritizes that, or doesn't even care, because the hostages that remain in the Gaza Strip are probably starving just like the rest of the population. They're being bombed just like the rest of the population. Many have died already that we know of. At least 30 or 40 have died from the Israeli bombardment of the Gaza Strip, the only ones that were released were through negotiations. And so I think, everything that Israel is doing is showing that it really has no intention of saving those people.
Thank you. Omar Shakir?
Thank you. I think my colleagues have said everything well. I will make 2 quick points on Rafa and on a ceasefire. The first is forcing the more than 1 million people in Rafa to again be forced to flee without a safe place to go in Gaza, and there is no safe place to go in Gaza, would be catastrophic and unlawful. And that needs to be the overarching message from the international community. The international community must take action to prevent further atrocity. International humanitarian law prohibits the forced displacement of civilians except when temporarily required for their security or imperative military reasons. There must be recourse to a safe place to go, which there isn't in Gaza. And we've warned that forcible displacement is a war crime. So the Israeli government does not have a great record, whether it's in the West Bank, the denial of return to refugees. When it comes to these crimes, the international community must prioritize not only preventing an unlawful and catastrophic Rafah incursion, but also the continuing unlawful airstrikes and other attacks that are taking place across Gaza. When it comes to a ceasefire, my colleagues, I think, described well some of the challenges that are there. But I want to make a human rights point, and I want to conclude on this, which is ceasefire or not, human beings are not bargaining chips. You cannot, as a matter of law, make the entry of life-saving aid contingent on a ceasefire. You cannot make the release of unlawfully held hostages. You cannot make continue doing unlawful attacks, unlawfully detaining. So we need to end these atrocities. And the reason why people are calling for a ceasefire is precisely because bodies of Palestinians continue to mount by the day because of the catastrophic situation. But the lack of a ceasefire cannot be an excuse to allow these abuses and atrocities to continue. There must be an urgency, whatever happens with Iran, whatever happens in the region. The people of Gaza, it's unimaginable how they're living with all they're facing that's been laid out today. Many more will die if the killing, if the bloodshed, of the starvation, if the collective punishment, of the demolition, of the destruction, of the denial of return continues. That must end.
Thank you, Omar. So before concluding, a big thank to all the guests, Tahani Mustafa from International Crisis Group, Omar Rahman from the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, and Omar Shakir from Human Rights Watch. Thank you for having been with us. Thanks again to our partner, the Middle East Council on Global Affairs in Doha, for the cooperation in the organization of this panel. Thanks to the audience, and see you soon. Goodbye.
Thank you, Aldo.